Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our talk today with Dominic Pacyga, entitled A Combustible Society, Chicago's Populations and the Great Chicago Fire. My name is Greg Storms, and I am the Manager of Public and Community Engagement here at Chicago History Museum. Before introducing Dominic, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited about this talk, and this, for me, is something that I'm very interested in, and I'm sure it is for all of you, or else you wouldn't be here, right? We're going to have a really great time, and we'll get right to it. But first, I would like to give some thanks. First, to my colleagues in the Education Department at Chicago History Museum, Erica Griffin, Director of Education, and Candace Bay, Education Engagement Coordinator, for their support in making today possible. Today's program is one of many that have developed in support of our recently opened exhibition, City on Fire, Chicago 1871, which explores both the physical and the sociocultural dimensions that led to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 and its recovery efforts. Designed with youth, families, and intergenerational conversations in mind, City on Fire provides context into Chicago at the time, itself a rapidly growing city made of wood, during a summer and early fall boasting perfect conditions for conflagration, including critical components of social and economic tensions smoldering away that required only a spark to start the fire. To support the exhibition, a robust roster of K-12 classroom, educator, and public engagements for all ages have been developed. As a relatively recent hire at the History Museum myself, I must say that even I am impressed not only with the quality of programming and services offered, but the quantity as well. I encourage you all to visit the exhibition website at www.chicago1871.org for more details, and I will add that to the chat here briefly, here soon. I would also like to thank our two major sponsors for the project, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, for the generous contributions in support of the City on Fire exhibition project. And with that, finally, let me introduce you to our speaker today, Dominic Pacyga, Professor Emeritus of History in the Department of Humanities, History, and Social Sciences at Columbia College Chicago. His books include Polish Immigrants and Industrial Chicago, Workers on the South Side, 1880 through 1922, Chicago, a Biography, and Slaughterhouse, Chicago's Union Stockyard and the World It Made, all from the University of Chicago Press. Pacyga is also the 2014, and forgive me, I'm going to mispronounce this, Mieczysław Heyman Award, please correct me, Dominic, afterwards, award winner for exceptional and sustained contributions to the study of Polish Americans. We are profoundly grateful for Dominic's support and contributions to the Chicago History Museum and for researching and sharing Chicago stories. And with that, I will mute and turn off my camera and hand the virtual mic over to you, Dominic. Thank you.
We're going to be talking about population changes in Chicago over time. And let's start with early Chicago. Early Chicago really saw a pattern of, already a pattern of class, racial, and a cultural conflict in the city of Chicago, or what would become the city of Chicago. So right from the very beginning, we're talking about Chicago as a very diverse place, first with the French coming in, often intermarrying with native populations, the British, Americans, etc. So Chicago was an early port. It attracted money from the East, New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and it attracted federal money. Population-wise, it attracted Yankees. Yankees from upstate New York and New England came in large numbers. In fact, the soldiers who occupied Fort Dearborn were of Yankee stock, and they wrote back to their friends and neighbors that the farming out here was pretty good, no rocks, no stones like in New England, and people began to come into the area. It also became, of course, a port for immigration and for westward expansion. When we talk about the Great Fire, I always talk about it as ushering in an era of urban chaos. So from about 1871 to 1904, the American city was bubbling over in divisions, in conflict. Some of these were racial, some of these were ethnic, some of these were social class. In Chicago, of course, the fire meant mass destruction. There was class and ethnic conflict afterwards. 1877 came the Great Railroad Strike, 1886 the Haymarket Riot, 1894 the Pullman Strike, 1904 the Meatpacking Strike. These are just the sort of high points of conflict in the city at that time. And much of this was came out of the fire, really. I mean, the imagination of the fire and class conflict and racial conflict, the rich versus the poor, the immigrant versus the native born. There were all kinds of rumors that the Anglo-Saxon population had took revenge on the Irish, especially, but on other immigrant groups as well, for starting the fire. There was even talk that the fire had been started by a French communard. Paris had burned earlier that year in the battle between the communards and French authorities. And the feeling was that these communists or communards had come to Chicago and set the city on fire as well. So there were all kinds of rumors. There were rumors that this was actually an attack by former Confederate soldiers who set the city on fire in revenge for the burning of Richmond, Virginia, of Atlanta, Georgia. So all kinds of rumors, and often in times of conflict, these rumors are perpetuated. Rebuilding the city rebuilding the city again after the 1874 fire brought up the issue of wooden buildings, but it also showed the need for more and more workers, and actually proved to be a factor in increased growth for the city. The city boomed after the fire of 1871 and the second fire in 1874. Partially, this was a response to industrialization. As mass production took off after the Civil War, it was a reaction to this new industrial America. And one of those reactions was the union movement, which caused more conflict on the streets of the city of Chicago. Turning to immigration, I have two maps here. One, of course, is a 19th century map that's on your left, and on your right is a more recent map of Europe. And one of the things to understand here is that in the 19th century, three major empires ruled over Central Europe: the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Turkish Empire ruled over much of what we would call the Balkans, that is Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Immigration for the most part will come from, whoops, sorry about that, let me go back. Immigration for the most part will come from Northern and Western Europe in the beginning, from about 1830 on. So here we see the Scandinavian nations, the British Isles, the German area. This will be the area that most immigrants are coming from at this time period, from 1870 to about from about 1830 to about 1890. So this is what we call first wave European immigration, basically from Northern and Western Europe and the British Isles. It was largely Protestant in culture, except for the Irish Catholics. And it predominated from 1820, 1830 to about 1890. These people were in some ways more assimilatable into American society. The dominant culture in the United States after independence was, of course, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And these people were much more easily brought into that culture as they immigrated into the country. Now, with the Irish, the exception of the Irish, of course, had a long history of arguing and fighting and rioting against the English occupation, British occupation of Ireland. Ireland was in many ways Great Britain's first colony. So there was a long-standing argument between the British and the Irish, and it played itself out in Chicago as well, as Irish immigration began to be one of the dominant factors in that first wave immigration wave. Here we see the traditional depiction of Mrs. O'Leary's cow sort of knocking over the lantern, totally falsified, but nevertheless potent. We see the O'Leary cottage as it stood after the fire in the picture to the right at the top. And of course, one of the traditional sketches of Chicago during the Great Conflagration. Why blame Mrs. O'Leary? Well, why not? Mrs. O'Leary had a lot of things going against her. One, she was a woman. Only a woman would be stupid enough to milk a cow at 9 o'clock at night. Two, she was an immigrant. That made her doubly more likely to do something bad. Three, she was Catholic. And four, of course, she was Irish as well. So all of these things sort of played into the popular conception of the Irish as this sort of rabble-rousing group that lived in Chicago, were congregating largely on the west side, but also on the north and south sides of the city at this point. And were seen as a real threat to white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture and domination in the city, especially on the political scene. There was, of course, a long history of anti-Catholicism in the country. Here we see a rather famous cartoon, a Nast cartoon about the American River Ganges, where we see crocodiles, which are really bishops, right, washing up on shore to attack white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and to bring Catholic control over the United States. In fact, one of the rumors at the fire was it was the beginning of a Catholic rebellion to take over America and to make the Pope emperor in the United States as well. The Irish responded to this prejudice, if you call it, by creating a sense of community, a sort of communalism. Here we have the Irish parish system, which sort of set a model for other immigrant groups as they came into the city, centering around a place of worship and fraternal organizations, businesses, schools, all with the idea of preserving the culture and the family in this new industrial America. The two churches here, of course, Old St. Pat's on your left on displays, and of course, Holy Family Parish on the west side of the city of Chicago next to St. Ignatius High School. Both of these churches still stand and are still operating as Catholic churches. And both, by the way, I should point out, and this didn't help with the rumors of Irish rebellion, both of those structures, of course, survived the fire of 1871. Irish tried to create, and were successful largely, in creating what we would call a cradle-to-grave community. That is, they created hospitals, churches, schools, businesses, funeral parlors, and of course, cemeteries, sort of protecting their communities from cradle to grave. Here we have the Irish Cemetery, which many of you may know, up in Evanston, a Calvary Cemetery, which served the entire city for the Irish for a good long time. German immigrants, however, soon overtook the Irish as the largest immigrant group in the city. Here we have a picture of St. Henry's Church and Cemetery on the north side of the city. The German group was actually very, very large. And in many cases, in many ways, this was a very Germanic city by 1900. Probably even by 1870, 1880, the German cultural impact on the city was rather obvious, and in many ways resented. You know, many of the Germans who had come to Chicago were 1848ers. They had taken part, or their families had been taking part in the German revolutions of 1848, the European revolutions of 1848. Ended up coming in exile and landing in America and bringing with them rather radical ideas about socialism, communism, anarchism. These, of course, would bubble up during the Haymarket Riot. They created a very, very important German American press, not only in Chicago, but across the country, as you can see from this slide. In Chicago, they created the German singing associations, especially the Germania Club. They had their North American singing fests held in Chicago in the 19th century, which became great gathering places for the German American community. And of course, they also celebrated what in ethnic taverns, and especially what was called then the Continental Sunday, sometimes referred to as the German Sunday. Remember that working class men and women worked 6 days a week. They had Sunday off. And now good Americans, of course, spent Sunday at home, reflecting on the Bible, spending time with their families. Germans tended to congregate in beer halls and beer gardens and celebrate this day off. And these places were often places of radical organizing as well. So there was a clash, this cultural clash. So as I mentioned before, there have been cultural clashes between different groups from this, in the city from the very beginning. When Father Marquette and Louis Joliet come here, Father Marquette represents the sort of cultural invasion of the area, Louis Joliet, this sort of imperial invasion of the area. They're Father Marquette's trying to convert Indians to Catholicism. Louis Joliet is claiming the land in the name of the King of France. All the way through Chicago history, as we'll see, in the 19th century, this was especially a volatile time for this, and perhaps it's a volatile time for it again, even today. Another large group in the 19th century were the Swedes, who came to Chicago, and they dominated many of the trades and crafts in the city. They too built a communal society based on the church. Here's a Swedish Baptist church at 59th and Emerald in 1910. That's in the Inglewood neighborhood. I know most of us think of Andersonville as the center of Swedish culture in the city, but Inglewood was also another center of Swedish culture, as was parts of Armour Square in Bridgeport. So there were also some West Side Swedish communities. So the Swedes, like the Germans and like the Irish and like other immigrant groups, really settled throughout the urban area. And of course, there's major organization. The Swedish organization was on the north side, the Swedish Club. Czechs began to come in large numbers just before the Civil War, but especially after the Civil War. And they originally settled in the area of what today would be the Gold Coast. They were basically driven out of that area, and many of them moved to the what today would be the South Loop, and then into the near West Side, and then finally into Pilsen. Here we see on your left the first Catholic Czech church, St. Wenceslas, which was on near West Side, not far from Holy Family, in fact, and Old St. Pat's. And here is St. Procopius Church, which was located and is still located in Pilsen. It was the center of Czech Catholic culture. But the Czechs, like the Germans, came in various flavors. The Germans came in Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish religious faiths and cultures. The Czechs also came as Catholics, Protestants, but also as free thinkers. Free thinkers or rationalists who objected to all organized religion, but were very much a nationalist group, helped to organize large groups of Czech immigrants and Czech Americans in the Pilsen and what we today call Little Village, but was called Czech California at the time as well. And these became very, very important in the struggle later on for Czech independence around World War I. They published their own newspaper, which, by the way, was also very anti-Catholic, the Svornost, and in other newspapers such as the Jenny Hlasatel. And the creation of fraternal groups. These were very, very important, not only in the Czech community, but across the ethnic spectrum. And the Czechs actually reached out to other immigrant groups from Eastern and Central Europe and helped them to settle in the city as well, in a sort of sense of Slavic brotherhood, a sort of pan-Slavism, especially with the Poles. Czech businesses located along the major streets of the near West Side and Lower West Side. That would be Blue Island Avenue, 18th Street, Cermak Road, or what was then just 22nd Street. East and Central and Southern Europeans flocked to Chicago after about 1870 or so. Yeah, the Poles came as early as the 1850s, but they were a very small group. They settled in German neighborhoods. They tended to worship in German churches. By 1860 or so, they're setting up their own parish system. Jews, of course, excuse me, German Jews settled in German communities, German Christian communities as well. Lithuanians, Greeks, Italians, all came into this super group of ethnic groups that made up the Chicago's diverse and sometimes volatile community. For the Poles, they settled, of course, on Westtown. Now, during the fire of 1871, the Polish community was already established. The first Polish church, St. Stanislaus Kostka, pictured here, but this is the second church. The church that stood at the fire was a wooden structure. Supposedly, the priests of St. Stanislaus Kostka climbed to the church tower and watched the city burn. It did not cross into the area. The area was not touched by the fire. One of the myths of the fire, of course, is that the whole city burned down. This is, of course, not true. About 1/3 of the city burned, and it left about 2/3 there still, which were ready and open for business the day after the fire. Of course, the railroads were not destroyed. Downtown railroad stations were destroyed, but the railroads themselves were still connecting the city built to the east and to the west. And so that natural resources could flow into the city and be sent east. For example, the Union Stockyard opened in 1865. It was not touched by the fire in 1871. It was still operating at that time. And wheat could be sent east, and profit could come back to Chicago and help the city to regrow. I think it basically was rebuilt in about 18 months to 2 years, which was a very fast time, and especially if you consider what's happened in New Orleans since Katrina and other places that have been hit by catastrophe in the 20th and 21st century. But anyway, so the Poles settled in what the Poles would call Stanisławowo, or the parish of St. Stanislaus, or today officially Westtown, or now it's called Wicker Park, largely because of real estate development. Here we see various photographs of the neighborhood. Polish Chicago, like the other groups, spread throughout the city. St. Stanislaus Kostka on the north, St. Adalbert's in Pilsen on the west side, then in Bridgeport and the Union Stockyards, the back of the yard, South Chicago, etc., as they moved across the cityscape, as they reacted to industrialization, which bubbled up more and more at this time. The Poles actually built about 60 Chicago parishes, Catholic parishes. There were also a whole group of Polish national Catholic churches that were also developed during this area. And don't forget Polish Jewish synagogues, which also played a vital role in both communities, both the Polish community and in the Polish Jewish community. So all of these institutions provided this sort of communal structure. Now, if you're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant looking at the development of what seems to be very, very foreign populations, foreign cultures in the middle of your city, there's a reaction to that, of course, and a fear of this. Who are these people? Why are they organizing these parishes, starting with the Irish and the Germans, going on to the Czechs and Poles and Slovaks and Lithuanians, Orthodox Christian communities such as the Serbian or Greeks or Russian communities as well. Who are these people? Why are they coming here? Why are they settling in? Why aren't they just becoming Protestants? Why aren't they just becoming Americans? Why don't they just accept the superiority of our culture? And why are they voting us out of power? The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community is losing political power in the city. And some politicians like Carter Harrison, the first, and his son, Carter Harrison II, or actually Carter Harrison III and Carter Harrison IV, depending on how you count it, are also playing the ethnic card. And they're bringing people into the Democratic Party. They're bringing these groups into the Democratic Party and helping the Democratic Party to use them to create a solid political base. This brought up many fears, and really, to an extent, results in the first round of suburbanization, which doesn't come in the 1920s or the 1950s. It comes really very early as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants begin to leave the city and move to the outskirts. Now, after the great annexation of 1889, many of these are brought back into the city as the city annexes the town of Lake, Hyde Park, and Rogers Park, Jefferson Park on the northwest side. But generally speaking, there is this feeling that somehow Chicago has become a foreign place. It's the same feeling in New York. It's the same feeling in places like Pittsburgh, Cleveland. And rural America reacts against this with very harsh anti-immigrant feelings, perhaps not unlike today. So there's this fear of the other. Whether that fear of the other is Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, who could be so stupid as to milk a cow at 9 o'clock at night and have a lantern by its foot, right? Only a woman, an immigrant, a Catholic, an Irish woman. But also the fear of losing control over an industrial society that has emerged very quickly. It's a period of tremendous transition. And after the Civil War, Chicago is the center of that industrialization, the center of that transition, especially in the Midwest. And the conflicts that happen. So Chicago is often portrayed as the Paris of the Midwest. We like to think ourselves as this great cultural center, literature, the arts, of course, architecture. But remember, Paris is a revolutionary capital, 1789, 1833, 1848, 1871 with the Communards. And in many ways, Chicago seems to be also emerging as a sort of strange revolutionary center in the heart of the Middle West. Add on to this race. The history of African Americans in the city is very long. It goes back to the very beginning. As early as the 1830s, there's references to African Americans. This, by the way, is, I believe, the oldest photograph we have of an African American in the city of Chicago. This is around somewhere close to what would today be Roosevelt Road and State Street in the 1850s. There's a black man standing in the doorway there at 649 State Street. This comes out of the Potter Palmer collections. So there's a long history. There's a very small number of blacks in the 19th century, but Chicago is an important place on the Underground Railroad. It is then in the 20th century, two waves of the Great Migration really shaped the 20th century. African-American families begin to flock to the city as early as the 1880s and 1890s, but really in 1950, in 1915, there's about 50,000 blacks in the city of Chicago. By 1920, it's about 100,000. It doubles again in the 1920s to about 209,000 by 1930. Then there's a slight pause in the Great Migration, and there's a second wave that goes from 1940 to 1975. It's an extended wave, tremendous growth. And the Black presence is felt throughout the south and west sides of the city, and in parts actually of the north side as well. So we see this huge transformation. So now we have ethnicity, which, by the way, in the 19th century is often considered race. There's the Slavic race and the German race and the Mediterranean races, okay? But in the 20th century, it becomes much more clearly a black-white conflict. Add on to that in the 1920s, the growth of the Mexican population, and you can see the great diversity that takes place. How does this relate to the fire? Well, the fire is this sort of beginning point because industrialization is just taking off. The fire wipes the slate clean in the center of the city, but it also draws as a magnet people to come to the city for work. Chicago is going to need thousands and thousands of workers to clear the rubble, to rebuild the city after 1871, and then to rebuild the South Loop after 1874, and then to man the packing houses and steel mills and tanneries and we often forget that Chicago was one of the centers of the garment industry. There were 40,000 garment workers in the city of Chicago, almost as large as amount as there was in New York City. So these tremendous industrialization that takes place, especially after the Civil War and then after the fire, transforms the city, makes it a place of promise. You know, they say about New York, if you can't make it there, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. But about Chicago, they say, if you can't make it there, you can't make it anywhere, because Chicago is such a place of opportunity. It's a city of immigrants, whether those are immigrants from the South, like African Americans, or immigrants from Europe or Asia or Latin America. By the 1880s, Germans predominate. but the Irish still have a substantial citywide group. Scandinavians are also important and growing. On the edge now are coming Eastern and Southern Europeans, a growing group. But by 1930, Polish Chicagoans are the largest group, and they overwhelm the Germans. And the Chicago population is 78% foreign born, or children of foreign born from 1890 to 1920. So if you are in Decatur, Illinois, or on a farm in somewhere in central Illinois, or even just outside the city in Naperville, and you look at this city, it seems so strange. 78% of the population, reaching actually at one point or another to over 80%, are foreign born, or they're the children of foreign born. How do you deal with that in a society that is changing rapidly, that is bringing up all the fears that industrialization brought, all the transformation that industrialization brought about? In some ways, we're living in that same kind of situation today, where technological change is changing everything in the economy. It's transforming manufacturing, it's transforming entertainment, it's transforming communication, it's transforming education. I mean, just think of what the last year and a half have meant for education in this country, or for the fact that we can't meet in person today, so that you can really show me how angry you are about my lecture. But we can't meet in person today because of the pandemic. The African American population growth, which I just touched on, has been very important. But today, Hispanics are the largest minority group. And the growth of the Asian population is pushing city council to perhaps create an Asian-dominated ward in the Bridgeport area, Bridgeport Armour Square area near Chinatown. What's the next group? Who knows? Will immigration continue to transform American society? Will immigration continue to be an issue, be both a positive and in some ways a negative thing in society, depending on how you look at it? That's a good question. How will it dominate the future of American society? Ethnic change is a constant source of conflict in the city. Irish and Germans, major riots in Bridgeport and other parts of the city between Irish and Germans. German versus Slav. This is an advertisement of Humboldt Park, one of the nearest and one of the most delightful suburbs of Chicago. I didn't grow up thinking Humboldt Park was a delightful suburb of Chicago. It was a vibrant part of the city, but here it is pictured as a suburb. You'll notice that this ad is half in English and half in German, because the developers are trying to attract Germans from not only the Lincoln Park area, but from the Milwaukee Division and Ashland area, where increasingly they're mixing with Slavic groups, especially the Poles, and the Germans are moving away. St. Boniface Church, shortly after the fire, actually shortly before the fire, on the near northwest side was a German parish. Poles began to go to mass there. They were met by angry Germans who tried to keep them out of the church. And in fact, a Catholic priest was beaten for giving communion and confession to Poles, who were basically migrated from the German-occupied part of Poland, that is from the area of the Poznań and Silesia. So Germans were moving out of that neighborhood. First wave European immigrants versus second wave European immigrants, then whites versus African Americans. We know the sad story of the 1919 race riot. 38 people killed, over 500 people wounded. White versus Latino in many neighborhoods. African American versus Latino. The majority of hate crimes a few years ago were between African Americans and Latinos. White versus Asian has appeared during the most recent COVID problem. And also now, Asian versus African American. It seems like we all come here to fight, but we all come here to stay as well, and eventually work out our difficulties. I think we can open it up to questions now, if there are any, and talk a little more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dominic. We do have a question from Ron Montaigne. It is, there are social safety nets today that help immigrants assimilate and become productive neighbors. How did that work back then? And did immigrants depend on family contacts alone as a bridge between old country and new? I'm particularly interested in Italian immigrants, but I'm sure it applies to all.
Yeah, I actually, it does apply to all. Immigrants tended to build communal organizations, which protected them in this community, but also made a connection to the homeland. The other thing that's extremely important is letter writing. The collection of immigrant letters is very fascinating. There are collections of immigrant letters from the Welsh back to Wales, the Scandinavians, Germans, Poles, Jews, Italians. And these letters talk about what it means to immigrate and how to not necessarily assimilate, but fit into the culture. Some of these letters actually go back and tell people, look, if you're coming, be careful in New York. You're going to get ripped off in New York. Somebody's going to ask you if you need help with your luggage, and then they're going to run off with your luggage. Or they're going to offer you a night stay in a hotel, and you'll find out that you're sold into white slavery. There are letters going back warning people of things. So there's always been this kind of safety net internally. Now today, what happens after the New Deal in 1930s, a larger safety net was created across the country. Remember, there's no Social Security in the 1890s until the 1937. There's no unemployment compensation. You don't even have to go to a doctor to get a job. You simply, for a checkup, you simply sign up in a meatpacking house. If you can walk, you can kill a hog. So all that is locally controlled to an extent by the community. This intricate network of parish fraternal organizations, Sons of Italy, the Knights of Lithuania, the Polish National Alliance, the Polish Roman Catholic Union. There are something like 1,500 Landsmannschaften groups for Jews in the city. Landsmannschaften groups were groups that created a connection between the old country and the new country. That is, if you came from a shtetl in Ukraine or Poland or Lithuania, you had a club here of people from that same shtetl who knew each other. This sort of the idea of Landsman, or in Italian paesani, or in Polish rodacy, the idea of the neighbor, someone that you owed communal help to, was very, very important. And don't forget the tavern. The tavern was a tremendously important institution in immigrant communities. It wasn't just a place to go get drunk. It was a place where you found information. So if you got off the train in downtown Chicago and you somehow made your way up to Milwaukee Avenue and you didn't really know where your cousin lived, you could stop into a tavern that had a sign in the window that says, we speak Polish, mówimy po polsku, and say to the bartender, maybe you know Stanley Kobyzinski. Yeah, he'll be here in about 20 minutes. His shift is off at the tannery on the river. He always stops in here. Have a seat. And if not, my daughter will take you to his house. He lives a few blocks away. So there's this connection that is created, this communal connection. And while it's different today, because we live in a different world, you can also see it, however, in Zooming. The first time I went to Poland, I was told I had to wait 24 hours by telephone to call home. 24 hours. I wasn't going to do that. The last time I was in Poland, I used Zoom, and I could talk to people right away, or FaceTime. So technology has, to an extent, transformed that social network. But the most important social network, I would argue, and this was true for the African American community as well, is the personal family connection. I hope that answers your question.
What a wonderful response. Thank you, Dominic. That was very thorough. The next question we have from 17088 is, how do you explain the political prominence of the Irish in Chicago, seeing as the Germans outnumbered them?
Well, So first of all, the Irish came from British-occupied Ireland, where a democratic system had been set up and had been manipulated by people so that the Irish didn't have much power. But they understood the institution. That was very important. They understood democratic institutions, even if in Ireland they were not allowed to fully participate in them or were outmaneuvered until Parnell and others. Secondly, they spoke English. That was very important. English had been forced on them. That's why they speak with a brogue. When English is forced on anyone, they speak with a brogue. There's a Scottish brogue and a Welsh brogue, and by the way, an Indian brogue and Pakistani brogue, because English was forced on those people as well. So you have this whole idea of these newcomers who do speak the language of the community, and they're Catholic. And Catholics are increasingly coming in large numbers after 1870, 1880, 1890. Especially after 1890, they overwhelmed the first wave immigration, the second wave immigrants, as we called them. And so the Irish are able to act as a bridge, right, between the Poles and the Germans and the Czechs and the Jews and so forth and so on. But don't forget that the father of the democratic machine is Anton Cermak, really. I would argue it isn't Sullivan, or some historians have argued about earlier rendition of the machine. I would say it's Anton Cermak, who, because the Czechs also play an important role in bridging these two communities. So I would say the Irish ability to organize and to speak English and to interact with these new immigrant groups, especially, remember, they dominate the Catholic Church as well, lets them establish a foothold. And by the way, they're old. They come at a very early time. At an early time when you did not have to be a citizen to vote in local elections, you had to just be a resident of Illinois for 6 months, and then you could vote, and that gives them a tremendous amount of political power from the very beginning. Thank you.
That was actually really interesting. Thank you. There's a lot of pieces there that I didn't know. I really appreciate, though, the fact that you brought up the importance of language. It's something that in my experience talking with people, that it gets acknowledged for people who do not speak English, but the importance of speaking English doesn't necessarily get the same acknowledgement. As it was critical. Thank you. The next question is from Kayla Muskin. How big was the impact of Hull House? Did they serve all immigrant groups?
Well, you know, Hull House had a tremendous impact, of course. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, when they opened Hull House on the west side in an old mansion, the old Charles Hull mansion, which, by the way, was a suburban retreat for the Hull family when it was built in the 1850s, provided a very important place for immigrants, especially among the Italian, Jewish, Greek immigrants and some Czechs and Poles as well of the near west side, and the Irish. But I would argue, and I'm sure there are those who would disagree with me, that Jane Addams didn't often have a total appreciation for the way that communal structure evolved and how important a factor it was for these communities. And while she provided a place for kids to go to kindergarten, playgrounds, to learn English, citizenship classes, she was totally against the tavern. I don't think she ever fully came to realization what a role that institution played in these communities. Was not all that friendly to Catholicism as well, and perhaps underappreciated the role that the church played in those Catholic communities and in the Greek Orthodox community as well. But of course, her role was extremely important, and she is the sort of mother of social work. Her Hull House maps in the 1890s, very important for sociologists, anthropologists, historians later on. And she opened the Hull House to social scientists from the University of Chicago and later from other places to study the problems of the immigrant. And it's really sort of the mother of sociology in the country, and played an important role. I think as sociology evolved, especially in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the role of Hull House began to slip away a little bit. The creation of the Chicago Area Project, which, by the way, we have our Chicago Area Project papers here at CHM. And one of the leaders of the Chicago Area Projects at UIC, Steve Bubach's papers are there, became very, very important as it began to recognize more the role of these communal institutions.
Thank you, and thank you for the plug on the Chicago area papers. I actually use them in my dissertation research early on. That's great. So our next question is from Patricia in the chat. She says, learned from visiting the fire exhibit at the museum that rebuilding aid after the Great Fire was only given to people who could prove they owned the house they burned. Did any immigrant group benefit from this type of aid?
Part of the problem with rebuilding afterwards was that some laws were attempted to be passed quickly that you could not rebuild in wood, and immigrant families could not afford building in brick. Now that was gotten around by local politicians who represented these areas. After the second fire of 1874, the law became much more strict. And that actually causes immigrant groups to move out to the fringes of the city and into the suburbs. So what were the suburbs then? Places like Back of the Yards and Canaryville and South Chicago on the northwest side, West Town, and up to Jefferson Park, where wood buildings could be more easily built. But I think you touch on a very important topic here. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society, which has morphed into the Metropolitan Family Services today, is the oldest relief organization in the city. And as I say, still exists as Metropolitan Family Services. In the beginning, it was controlled by the Fields and Armours and other upper class families who did not feel very open to these immigrants, and you really had to, the whole concept of the worthy poor versus the unworthy poor. So if you were a drunk or an unskilled worker in 1871 on October 6th, don't come looking for a handout on November 6th, because we've got other people to deal with, people that were responsible and had homes and families and understood what America was really about. So a lot of the anti-Irish and anti-Catholic prejudice was aimed at these, even at this point. But people, as my colleague Ellen Scarrett has pointed out, Holy Family Church on the west side opened its doors. So did St. Ignatius College, then now high school, opened its doors to the poor who were fleeing the fire. And there was a lot of sort of unofficial charity as well. Now, some of this was basically opposed by the city government, who said, no, everything has to go through the Chicago Relief and Aid Society. So, as I've said before, we talk about, forgive me, but we talk about race and ethnicity and gender till the cows come home in this country. But we rarely talk about social class, because that's something nobody wants to touch. That's, radical communism. But social class plays an important role, both in the rebuilding of the city and in the pre-fire and the post-fire city. And it's part of that whole struggle of era of urban chaos, which, I said stops around 1904, because the progressive period comes on and there's reform, thanks again largely to people like Jane Addams. But that struggle maintains itself. And I would argue with you today that even today, gentrification is more about social class than it is about race or ethnicity or anything else. It's about social class, who can pay for what, and who can stay in a neighborhood once the neighborhood begins to change over social class wise. But I think there were a lot of private charitable organizations, especially among Catholics and Jews, that tried to deal with the fire. But that main trust really did have this idea of who is the worthy poor. So is Marshall Field the worthy poor because he lost his, department store, or Potter Palmer the worthy poor because he was a major real estate developer? And maybe that's taking it a little too far, but was the fellow who owned, a nice house on somewhere on 22nd in Michigan, or I'm sorry, up north, more likely to be helped. And in many cases, that proved true.
Thank you. And yet, I definitely encourage everybody to come in to see the exhibit. There's a pretty fun interactive within it that really talks to this topic specifically. Our next question is from Dave. Are Chicago or any large city neighborhoods in general as, quote, tight as they once were?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by tight, but no, I think things have changed. I think, once again, we don't really, one of the big factors, and this is something I've not touched on today, but one of the big factors is public transportation and communications. So people begin to spread out across the cityscape. So you get people, for instance, I'm from the Polish American community, and about 90% of the Poles now live in the suburbs. And people will come back to me and say, why can't we have a Polish alderman? Why can't we have a Polish, when Kuczynski and Derwinski and Rostenkowski were in Congress, why can't we do that? Well, you don't live in the city anymore. You've moved out, you've dispersed. You're across hundreds of suburbs. So you've lost the clout you once had. Or people say, why can't we save this parish? Well, my reaction to that is, you can save it. Move back into the neighborhood and put $1 in the basket every Sunday and go to mass. You can't replace something that is now gone. So it's not as tight as it once was. But I would tell you that the Mexican community is very tight. The Puerto Rican community is very tight. Working class communities still come together. And as assimilation takes place, or upward mobility takes place, or, we don't really assimilate in this country, we acculturate. So we dress like other Americans, we eat like other Americans, and we go to sports like other Americans, but maybe at Christmas time we have something special. Or maybe when we talk to our parents or grandparents, we speak in another language. Or maybe our children become interested in what their grandfathers and grandmothers were doing. And so it's not so much that we totally assimilate, but we acculturate. I mean, most of us know who Elvis Presley was, or Babe Ruth, or Hank Aaron, or Chico Carrasquel. But we stay in our ethnic communities, and this is perhaps more for an anthropologist or a sociologist than for me to talk about. But when I ask my students what they do at Christmas time, they say, "Oh, we look for a pickle in the Christmas tree." Well, that's very German. Or we break wafer, say a little prayer. That's very East European. That's very Polish. Or at Easter time, at Christmas time rather, and at Easter time we color eggs and we have a special blessing of baskets. That's a holdover, or is it? Is it that ethnicity and those traditions have evolved into something that's basically American, but also not?
Thank you. I think that's a really important point for folks to take away, the distinctions between assimilation and acculturation and its impact. So we have time for one more question quickly. And it's a broad one from Sandy. Can you tell us about the second fire of 1874?
Sure. I can tell you a bit about it. It starts in the South Loop, really around Roosevelt Road, and burns through areas that were that had escaped the fire. Fires are strange things. I taught at Columbia College for almost 40 years. And Where Columbia College is, the city didn't burn, but everything north of Columbia College burned. The wind shifted and the fire went that way. So a lot of the South Loop had not burned. And when it did burn in 1874, which thanks to another fire, it didn't spread into the downtown because some of the areas were still open fields that had not been fully restored yet from the fire of 1871. But it burned basically poor neighborhoods and red light districts, because the South Loop was already emerging as the levee. So there were houses of prostitution, gambling houses, there were lots of saloons. A lot of that stuff burned down, was destroyed in the fire of 1874. And the Tribune even says, this was a great fire, unlike the first fire, which was terrible because, Marshall Field and Potter Palmer and the Tribune lost their building. But this fire got rid of a lot of garbage, because it got rid of a lot of poor housing where poor people lived. So now we can rebuild better, and it won't become a red light district. Well, houses of prostitution have money, and they came back and they built back even better with stone buildings after the fire of 1874. So it once again, what catastrophe does is it often brings to the fore the underlying conflicts of society. So social class. I think in both fires, social class becomes very, very important, But especially in that 1874 fire, it's these Jews that are down there, and these Irish and these Italians wiped out, they'll move to the suburbs. We can rebuild a great white Anglo-Saxon Protestant city again. And of course, that doesn't happen. Because once change takes place, it's hard to stop change. Whether that's gentrification today, or whether it's racial change in the 1950s, or whether it's ethnic change in the 1890s, once change takes place, it becomes almost unstoppable. And so the levee builds back better and stronger than ever, and does not dissipate for a very long time. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I had an amazing time listening to you talk today. I'm certain everybody else here did. I know I learned quite a bit myself, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
It's very kind of you.
I would also like to thank everybody who has been on this call for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for an email with a evaluation survey. We really would appreciate it if you took just a few minutes out of your day to complete that, because it really helps us bring you more programming like this and new programming in the future. I also encourage you to check out our Family Day next week. It's titled Designing for Healthy Communities, in partnership with the Chicago Mobile Makers. That will be held on Saturday, November 13th from 12 to 2 p.m. It's a live interactive piece. It's largely made for children, but I think adults will definitely get something out of this as well. It's a fun activity. We will also have just a little bit earlier in the day, and then in the middle of this event, character-led tours of the City on Fire exhibition, which is a lot of fun. Our actors are amazing and do a wonderful job. So I definitely recommend you check that out. Again, that will be live and in person here at the Chicago History Museum. For more of this and for upcoming events at the History Museum, again, please check out our event page at www.chicagohistory.org/events. And thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.